Alrighty there, people. So what we're going to be diving into today, the title of this lecture is The Protestant Reformation, Pilgrims and Puritans, and this is in conjunction or in preparation for looking at the literature of the colonial period. So immediately we're going to be reading William Bradford, John Winthrop, and then in the next 2 weeks we'll also move into Michael Wigglesworth, the exquisite poetry of the 10th muse lately sprung up in America, Anne Bradstreet, and the metaphysical and intellectually challenging Puritan poetry of Edward Taylor as well. So all of these people here are Puritans. But before we really get to understanding what a Puritan is, we have to have a nice, clear understanding of the Protestant Reformation in order to sort of get to why Bradford refers to himself and his group as Pilgrims, famously in 1620. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the Protestant Reformation. So in order to do that, what I want to do is first start off with just a little, maybe 5 or even 10-minute, maybe recap of Western Civ, and just to sort of get up to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation begins in 1517. So we're just going to kind of quickly and maybe just kind of clarify some terms, historical terms, the Middle Ages, in between the Pax Romana and the Renaissance, before we get to the Reformation. We're just going to make sure we're on the same page. So here we go. So the Middle Ages. So what are they in the middle of? So roughly speaking, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we've got this, 1,000-year roughly period from the 5th century to the 15th century in Europe. This is beginning after the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana is the term for the first 2 centuries CE. So 1800 to 2000 years ago, the first 2 centuries CE, which was the height of the Roman Empire. The Roman peace is what it means. After that time period of the Pax Romana, in the next couple hundred years, after the height, there we slowly get to the downfall of the Roman Empire. And so this time period when the Roman Empire is definitely in decline is certainly by the 4th century and most certainly by the 5th century. So again, that's, roughly 1600 years ago, in the 5th century, as the Roman Empire had shifted. Emperor Constantine in the 4th century had shifted the capital from Rome to Byzantium in what would be present-day Turkey, renamed that city after himself, Constantinople. That's in the 4th century. And then by the 5th century, there is clearly a power vacuum where the Roman Empire had been in southern Europe. So over the next literally several centuries, as nation states begin to evolve, which will become nation states much later, begin to evolve, the papacy becomes a little bit more power. Well, papacy establishes itself really in the early 400s. Pope Innocent I, who was really a genius at sort of convincing other Christian communities into asking his office. This is Pope Innocent I in the very beginning, the 400s, maybe the first 2 decades of the 400s. Really great at convincing other Christian communities to ask his office to confirm their different policies and disputes. So that's where basically the power of the papal authority and the Roman Catholic Church begins then in the early 400s, strengthened a little bit. In that same century, Pope Leo I actually is supposedly somehow helped to convince Attila the Hun not to sack Rome. And so we can just kind of see from these little things that the papacy is beginning to grow in power. So again, that's the 5th century, the beginning of the Middle Ages. When do the Middle Ages end? Well, the Renaissance, the rebirth of appreciation in Greek and Roman culture, mythology, and learning that spreads northward from Florence, Italy. So the Middle Ages we're talking about from, again, roughly the 5th century to the 15th century, about a 1,000-year period. So let's talk about the Renaissance, be clear about what that is. We've all heard the term, and most people have a vague understanding, but it's nice to be clear about it. So the Renaissance is this definition suggests it's and that's literally what Renaissance means. It's a rebirth, a reinterest in Greek and Roman architecture, art, literature, humanistic learning. So this originates, as it says, in Italy in the 14th century, specifically really in Florence, for specific reasons, really sort of, it's not just a sort of accident that it happens. Florence is wealthy. Florence has got the first modern banking system in Europe in the 1300s. And with a good banking system and good industry, they have wealth. And when people have wealth, many times they use it to spend on the arts. And so that's really the birth of the Renaissance, is because of the wealth of Florence and then the ability for them to, patronize. And so then we get, all in the later in the 1300s and the 1400s, artists that we all know, like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. So, and it's not just art, it's not just painting or, sculpture like David or something like that. It's also a renewed interest in everything that was Greek and Roman, after 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, which it's probably incorrect to, say that the Middle Ages are, that there's less vitality or there's less learning or something like that. But certainly the idea of individualism in general is certainly muted during the Middle Ages. And so even just like the idea of the individual, Petrarch, the poetry of Petrarch, and other writers sort of look back to the power of Rome from 1,000 years earlier. So that's one of the Renaissance isn't just about the painting, it's also about a rebirth in the idea of individualism, and architecture as well too. The Roman architecture is fascinating and extremely advanced mathematically. Now that wave of interest really and a change in humanistic learning moves slowly northward, we could say, gets into England finally in the early 1500s. And then I put there that we consider the Renaissance ending with Shakespeare in England in 1610. That's when The Tempest was. That's kind of a stretch to say. First of all, the Renaissance doesn't ever really necessarily end, because the hallmarks and qualities of it they never go away. They influence the changes in the 1500s, the Reformation. They certainly, without a doubt, influence the major historical occurrence in Europe in the 1600s, that being the scientific revolution. And so it's not like the Renaissance ever dies. It just sort of, maybe the ideas and the spirit of it get transformed or transmuted into religious change and then in scientific inquiry and things like that. But it's kind of also nice to be like, well, let's have it sort of not ending, but let's have a closed point. So and that's, Shakespeare's last play is The Tempest, and when you read it, it's much easier to read it as some sort of critique of exploration and colonization, and so you can really see that the idea of what that is studying in The Tempest is changed. So, all right, so Renaissance, beginning of the 1300s in Italy and Florence, moving upward. We want to get to England and talk about England. So in bullet point number 2 there, we have, I've written Pietro Torrigiano's tomb for Henry VII is Italian Renaissance brought to England. It literally is. Torrigiano was Italian, wonderful, wonderful craftsman and artist, and he's actually kicked out of Florence and offered a commission by King Henry VIII. So at the bottom there it says King Henry VIII brings the Reformation to England, really brought the Renaissance as well, because he commissioned Torrigiano to come up and build a tomb for his father, King Henry VII, which is beautiful work of Renaissance art and still probably in Westminster Abbey. So anyway, So King Henry VIII, we're going to be dwelling on him in a few minutes rather extensively because he is the person, the monarch who rules from 1509 to 1547, who without a doubt brings the Protestant Reformation to England. So we're going to circle back to him in just a moment. But before we do, we've got to get into the main point here and the main subject matter, which is the Reformation. That's the subject of this lecture, and it's the main thing that we need to understand before we can get to the Puritan writers, Bradford, Winthrop, Wigglesworth, Bradstreet, etc. We've got to understand the Protestant Reformation. So, the Reformation is, without a doubt, the most important historical event of the 1500s. What is being reformed? It's really simple. Well, it's complex, but it's simple to remember. The Reformation is the reforming of the single most powerful institution on the European continent, the one Christian Catholic Church. So, as I mentioned, in the early 400s, with Pope Innocent I, the office of the Pope really created itself, fashioned itself as the one legitimate hierarchical top of Western Christendom that lasts for over 1,000 years. Now, there are a few there are certainly some incidents, especially in the 1300s and the 1400s, where the Catholic Church is weakened. But it's also completely accurate to say that if you're a Christian, if you're in Europe, period, for 1,000 years, you are a Catholic. That's all there is. There's only Catholicism. Very couple tiny small little exceptions later on, but there's nothing else. All of the churches that are that proliferate now, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregational churches, Anglican churches, Pentecostal churches, Baptist churches, all of those things are products of the Protestant Reformation from the year 1517. So we'll talk about that in just a second. And just as a real quick, before we get to that, in 1517, the Catholic Church was, as it says, there are a few cracks in the hegemony of the, one powerful church. And specifically, like when we look into like the 1300s, that time period is a terrible century, over a century for Catholic history. In the early 1300s, the Pope who was elected was French rather than Italian, and he moved the papacy from Rome to the south of France, to Avignon. So that's in the 1300s. The papacy is then in France instead of in Rome for, I think, 7 decades, something like that, nearly 100 years. That creates problems and terrible resentment from all the Italian cardinals. And so towards the end of that, there is what's referred to as the Great Schism, when another Italian pope is elected. Now there are 2 popes. That goes on for a couple of decades, maybe 3 or 4 decades, maybe 30, 40 years. And then it's finally resolved. But so there is clearly the one Catholic Church is fallible, no doubt. And then there are other things, people who have problems with different aspects of doctrine, people who want to reform and who want to change things in England and in Northern Europe especially. But we're going to jump to the most important person who just changes everything. So to be quite clear, the Protestant Reformation begins in the year 1517. And there we have Martin Luther looking serious, and because he was a serious fellow. So let's talk about him. He'll be the 2 figures connected with the Reformation that are the 2 most important. Is, first of all, Luther, who starts the Reformation. So who was he, and how, and what was the Protestant Reformation specifically? So Luther is, first of all, he's a devout Catholic. He was a very, very serious religious man. He's a monk, and he took his relationship with God very seriously. He was very intelligent. He had a PhD in theology, and he was a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. And there's no doubt that in the early 1500s, there were policies, let's call them, of the Catholic Church, which were there's no way to not look back on them historically and say, well, those were not the best policies to have for a religious institution. And there's no doubt that the Catholic Church needed reformed, and it would reform itself partly as a response to Martin Luther. But anyway, so in 1517, here's this devout Catholic monk who one of the major grievance that he had was something called the sale of indulgences. So according to medieval Catholic doctrine, when a person dies, they go to purgatory. Purgatory is some sort of waiting place, I understand, similar to hell, but not eternal. And in purgatory, you're paying for basically the sins that you committed in your earthly life. Now, over the course of a couple centuries, there were, at first it was just, a Christian would do penance almost sort of in advance. Well, a person would do penance for their sins that they'd committed, what the priest would tell you to do. That's really not that, nothing really problematic with that, perhaps. But by the time Luther was a professor and, writing and thinking about these matters in 1517, the way that the Catholic Church had basically tried to profit off of people's fears about the afterlife, and so you made financial contributions to the church, and those financial contributions took away from your time in purgatory. You could make financial contributions for your dead father, or someone like that whose soul the church would say was perhaps in purgatory right now, but make this, financial contribution. There was even an advertising campaign in an area around Lutheran Germany that one of the, I forget who it was, a bishop or someone who had created literally an advertising campaign for contributions to the Catholic Church. Something like once coin and coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Well, anyway, so Luther is, as I said, a devout Catholic who's not at all happy with the idea of himself or the people that he cared for, other Christians who obviously aren't as educated as he is. He isn't at all happy with the idea that they think that they don't have to worry about their worldly life and that they can just make amends for their soul with, financial contributions. So in 1517, on All Saints' Day, October 31st, 1517, he does something which was a scholastic thing to do, which was to post a proposition of your points that you want to argue, his 95 theses, to post that publicly on the door of Wittenberg Castle in order to start a conversation, and to what he wanted to do was very simply reform his Catholic Church that he loved, that he was a part of. So, but things sort of spiraled in some ways, partly because Luther was so intelligent, so headstrong, so stubborn, and somebody who really cared about his relationship with God and what he thought other people should feel as well. And there were lots of other things that he found fault with. The Pope did not want to reform things, and after about 4 or 5 years, eventually Luther is excommunicated from the church. He is protected politically and militarily by the political ruler of that small area where he was at, Frederick of Saxony, who saw, perhaps was a very smart individual, very crafty, Frederick, and could see that all of this money was leaving Germany, going straight to Rome, to the Pope, and so he protected Martin Luther politically and militarily for that reason, for other reasons to do with other political reasons as well. And this kind of became, so there were more than one reasons why the Reformation sort of takes hold so quickly. And also there is the fact that in less than a century earlier in 1455, 1456, the printing press is invented in the West. And so by the time Luther is writing things can be printed quickly. So that's a really key sort of historical, maybe almost like coincidence. And literacy rates by the 1500s are rising. In the Middle Ages, your typical peasant in Europe was definitely not literate, no reason for them to be. And in fact, the Catholic Mass during the Middle Ages, since so few people could read, sometimes even the priest couldn't read, perhaps, they're conducted in Latin, and a lot of the service, perhaps we could say, or a lot of the what went into the religious experience for, again, a typical peasant in Western Europe in the Middle Ages was more, had to do with icons and visual representation. That's why stained glass windows from before the 1500s and sculptures and engravings within churches, they were showing, for example, a Christian, they were showing the visual representation of like the seven sacraments or the crucifixion or something like that. Anyway, so all of these, but the Protestant Reformation begins with Martin Luther in 1517, specifically with his desire to reform the church. The Pope doesn't want to reform the church, excommunicates him, and Luther's ideas are protected and then spread all over Western and Northern Europe. Things come up to England, etc. So that's the beginning of the Reformation with Martin Luther. Now, there's one other figure we want to talk about just within the Reformation who is perhaps equally as important as Luther, and he comes along just a little bit later, and that's John Calvin. So why is Calvin important? Calvin is important because Calvin is also a devout Christian, and he comes along just a little bit later than Luther, and he is a theologian, and his writings he's also a lawyer. John Calvin is a lawyer, and when you go to read his actual writings from the 16th century, his main large book that he wrote and revised, I think it was originally published in 1536. It's called The Institute of Christian Religion. It was revised and added to and changed and republished continuously. And his arguments, Calvin's arguments, are definitely those of a lawyer. He's arguing about theology, about what a person's relationship should be like with God. And for Calvin, and the reason I have his name up here, so Luther starts the Protestant Reformation, but Calvin is the most important theologian who basically influences the direction of non-Catholic Christianity in Europe all through the 1500s, all through up until the 1600s as well. And the people who come over, the people that we're reading, Bradford and Winthrop, those are people who have been influenced and believe in the theological tenets of Calvin. One of Calvin's most important theological tenets is that of predestination. Predestination being the idea that one's soul is predestined for heaven or hell, period. Calvin had his conception of God as a very powerful, omnipotent being. And so for Calvin, that included, he took it in this, again, his writings are that of a theologian, but one who is a lawyer, which he was. And so when you read his writings, he goes through these legal sort of twists and turns and things which are just very intellectually challenging to read, but sort of fun too, because they're so difficult. But anyway, Calvin really presses the idea of predestination, that our souls are already chosen to go to heaven or hell. And that, although that may seem very bleak to us, that was something that people believed in. And now here's the interesting thing, and this will feed into the Puritans in just a moment, into the people that we're reading. Interestingly, one might think that if you believed, let's pause for a moment. Think, okay, I believe in predestination. Pretend you do believe in predestination. Well, for me, if I were to pretend for a moment that I believed in predestination, it might give me a rather, sort of bleak outlook, or even maybe some kind of like existential freedom, like, oh, I can go commit whatever acts of sketchy moral things. I can go rob and kill and steal and, do whatever I want to because my soul is already predestined to heaven or hell. I have nothing to do with it. However, that is not at all how people in the 16th and 17th century who believed in predestination felt. What Calvin said in his writings was that it is your duty then as a Christian, it is your duty to look, this is so important, it's really fascinating on like a psychological level, that it is your duty to look for signs of election within yourself. Signs of election. Election being the term for, that you're going to heaven. You're elected to go to heaven. So those are the people, which again, Calvin is immensely, his ideas are immensely popular and influences lots of different schools of thought, which will become different types of churches in Europe and send people over to America in droves, send people over to the New World in droves, and tens of thousands of people in the 1600s. So again, for people who are reading and appreciating Calvin in the 16th century, their response sort of emotionally or spiritually when they believe in predestination was actually to look within themselves for signs that they were destined for heaven, and then they acted on that. It somehow shifted their sort of mindset, and then they looked to make all of their speech and their actions be an example of the fact that they hopefully were going to, that they were part of the elected and that they were not going to hell. So again, those are the two most important people in the Reformation. Martin Luther starts it. Calvin's writings are the most influential. Great. Now what we're going to do is shift gears again. Now that we understand what the Reformation is, the Protestant Reformation, and we're going to go back to England. So Luther began things in 1517. Calvin's published writings, the first publication of the Institute of Christian Religion, was in 1536. And now we're going to go, back north to England and get into the 1530s there. And what this slide says is Protestant theology to political power, because we're going to see that for these people in Europe who are believing in these ideas put forth by Luther, wonderful ideas as well. Luther's main point in so many of his different writings was that you don't need a priest or a cardinal or a bishop. You don't need any of the that hierarchical structure of Catholicism. You only need to be able to read the scripture yourself and figure out what your relationship is to God. And so it's a very, there's no way not to look at what Luther did originally and not say, well, it was empowering for people to have the option finally to believe that it was just sola scriptura. It's the only thing that your relationship with God is based upon is the Bible, is scripture. So anyway, however, King Henry VIII is going to bring Protestantism to England for his own purposes. So there we have Martin Luther on the left, we have King Henry VIII on the right. So let's look at what what King Henry VIII does with this new movement, Protestantism, which is sort of sweeping through a lot of Northern Europe. So I think that first point I already talked about, King Henry VII. So King Henry VIII brings the Reformation to England. So how and why does he do that? So King Henry VIII reigns from 1509 to 1547. So it's in this time period that Luther, his actions in 1517, and then later Calvin, this is all during King Henry VIII's reign. Now, King Henry VIII originally, even before point 2 there, it says King Henry wants an annulment from the Pope. But before that, let's be clear, originally in the 1520s, King Henry VIII has no interest in Protestantism. King Henry VIII is someone who likes power for himself. He cannot imagine wanting to grant poor people and his subjects in England with any kind of even religious freedom, that would never play into his ideas. However, here's what happens. King Henry VIII wants a son very bad, and he's got a wife, a Spanish, very, very Catholic wife, Catherine of Aragon. And this wife, who is a few years older than King Henry VIII, is by this time in her early 40s. She's had many miscarriages. She has had one child for King Henry VIII, a daughter, and the king wants a son, and he wants a son badly. And now he sees not only has his wife had several miscarriages, but she's 40. There's no way he's going to get a son from her. And he wants, as point number 2 says there, he wants an annulment from the Pope. A lot of times when you read some history books, or if you see people say he wanted a divorce. Technically, he wanted an annulment, but whatever. He wants to get rid of his wife, and the only person that can grant that is the Pope. The Pope is not in a position to do that. The Pope would, because oftentimes popes make all kinds of concessions for important rulers, whether it's a king of England or France or whatever, and so perhaps the Pope would, but King Henry's wife is of Spanish nobility. I think her nephew perhaps is the Holy Roman Emperor of Germany. So anyway, the Pope says no, repeatedly says no. King Henry is obsessed with this idea, and so what he does is he starts figuring out different ways and looking actually at legal remedies for himself. He convenes lawyers around himself and figures out a way to, not necessarily stop England from being a Catholic nation, but stop the Pope from being the head of the church in England. So that's what he's originally trying to do. And this is over the course of years and years. And while this is going on, the king is also eyeing a woman in court that he would prefer to be married to, who's much younger, Anne Boleyn. So eventually, to make a long story short, King Henry VIII breaks with the Catholic Church, and now we're getting into the 1530s. As he does that, and as the Pope has never gone along with him, and the Pope will eventually excommunicate him. At that point, King Henry VIII is, and there are also people, by the way, so the king may not be doing this for moral reasons or for reasons that we would consider acceptable today. He's definitely not doing it for any sense of what he sees as a vision for religion being practiced in his country or anything like that. However, by this time, there are people who are reading writings of Luther and Calvin and others, and Protestantism is something that people, not everybody by all means, but some people are interested in. Some of the important members of King Henry's court and legal team, especially, are Cambridge scholars, and Cambridge scholars at that time tended to be, I don't know if I would say susceptible or amenable towards Protestant ideas. So Protestantism was sort of creeping in, and some of his advisors said, well, let's just go full throttle with this, which he does. So he dissolves all the and by the way, just to kind of think about how important this is, there are some estimates that before the Protestant Revolution, so in the the late Middle Ages in Europe, that the Catholic Church owned somewhere between 15 to 20% of all land in Europe. Think about that for a moment. I'll say it again. There are some estimates that before the Reformation, in the late Middle Ages, that the Catholic Church owned 15 to 20% of all land in Europe. We're talking about farms that are connected to monasteries, where monks are producing and selling crops. Literally the land is owned by the Catholic Church. Money from the sale of crops and other things are going back to Rome. So Henry also realizes that if he breaks from the Catholic Church, then all of the land that is technically owned by the Catholic Church, the institution, he can just sort of absorb that all. So this is referred to as the dissolution of the monasteries, and then that gets him, a lot of money basically, and he needs money. So he sells some of that land. It's not that he just absorbs it and makes it part of. He'll also sell it to different people in England. So there we go. So that's how Protestantism evolves in England. King Henry VIII eventually breaks completely from the Catholic Church, dissolves, and then if you're a priest, you have two choices. You can break from the Catholic Church yourself and become a priest within what King Henry calls the Church of England, the C of E, or you can be kicked out of England. And if you're a person who disagrees with this, then you can be burned, executed, period. Matter of fact, King Henry had no problems executing Catholics as well as people who were too radically Protestant. So he was an equal opportunist when it came to that. So anyway, eventually King Henry VIII dies, and let's just really briefly talk about his successors. So right after he dies in 1547, his young, sort of weakly son, King Edward VI, comes to power, who tries to follow in his father's footsteps as far as being Protestant. He only rules for 6 years, and so it's basically the people who are his advisors who make decisions, but those are Protestants too. So that's a short little 6-year period. After Edward VI dies, Henry's daughter from that first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Mary Tudor, comes to power. She is sort of religiously, so follows in her mother's footsteps, still has strong ties and beliefs to the Catholic Church. So from 1553 to 58, Mary reinstates Catholicism, so it's like a whiplash for the whole nation of England as Catholicism is reinstated. Protestants who give her too much trouble, she kills, and hence she gets the nickname, which you have heard before, although you may not have connected it to her, Bloody Mary. So that's a 5-year period. Then after that, bullet point number 3, after Edward VI, Mary Tudor, King Henry VIII's other children, then Queen Elizabeth comes to power in 1558, and as it says there, the Protestant queen creates a middle way in Christianity. And just as a brief, so of course Queen Elizabeth I, represented in so many different movies, TV shows, etc., rules from 1558 to 1603. And just as a historical footnote, which is sort of fascinating and very ironic, so Henry VIII's whole deal was that he needed a son. He wanted a son to succeed him. And he got a son, and eventually his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, rules. And even now, modern historians look back at Queen Elizabeth's rule from 1558 to 1603. And again, even modern historians will look back and say, she did things that were so intelligent. She slowly sort of helped England she helped with national identity. People loved her. People came to believe in her. She sort of molded a real English identity for people. And luckily, with some luck and with some good captains, her navy became powerful. And she was, again, modern historians look back and say that it's quite clear that Queen Elizabeth was a very intelligent, very capable, and very competent monarch, much more so than her father. And again, it's just kind of funny that he was so gung-ho on having a son. Well, it turns out his daughter was a wonderful monarch, for the time, as far as, promoting English interests and making the country stronger. And briefly, I'll just say that it's not just Queen Elizabeth I, but if you look back in the past 500 years of English monarchs, the three that have reigned the longest and probably reigned the best in their time period were all women. So Queen Elizabeth I there, Queen Victoria from 1837, basically the whole 19th century, Queen Victoria. who by the end of her reign, England is, arguably the most powerful nation on earth. And then even now, Queen Elizabeth II, who's the current monarch of England, people sometimes think that she's just a figurehead, but really she's a very astute woman politically, and she, keeps a strong Commonwealth of Nations connected to England. So a very smart woman too. Anyway, fabulous. So there it says at the bottom that Queen Elizabeth's Church of England is cautiously Protestant, but still retains many aspects of Catholicism. So Queen Elizabeth is a very smart woman. She recognizes not only was she sort of tutored by people who were Protestants, and so she believes in Protestantism rather than Catholicism, but also by the time she comes to power in 1558, there are probably more people in England, her subjects, who also are Protestant by that time. So she's always sort of reading the people and making intelligent decisions for the nation. And so she reverses what Mary Tudor had done. So it's obviously Protestant under Queen Elizabeth. And so I put there, it's cautiously Protestant. So basically what Queen Elizabeth did was she kept many aspects of Catholicism within the Church of England. And so it wasn't really much of a big difference. It wasn't Catholicism. It was like a light Catholicism in the Church of England. So it's still very similar in many ways. Now, however, if you are one of those sort of more radical Protestants who believes very specifically in Calvin's writings, you believe very strongly in your faith, although they're also Protestants, these people came to view the Church of England that Queen Elizabeth was sort of creating and controlling and deciding, policies about. They came to view this as still retaining too many aspects of Catholic faith. So now let's finally get to this term, which is so important. Again, this term Puritan, which applies to all of the people that are on our, or most of the people that we're doing in our readings for the next couple of weeks in any early American literature class. William Bradford, Puritan. John Winthrop, who sails across in 1630, Puritan. And then later on in the next unit, Michael Wigglesworth, Anne Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, all these people are Puritan. So what is a Puritan? Well, it's somebody who's a Protestant, but who, as the definition says, they're a member of a group of English Protestants who advocated strict religious discipline along with purification of the Church of England of its Catholic heritage. So are there people who just believe that the Church of England, the Protestant, non-Catholic Church of England, hasn't gone far enough? And so that's what a Puritan is. They want to purify things even more. So that gives us a good understanding of that. So let's look at a specific Puritan who we'll be reading, and the very first person that you'll be reading, and that is William Bradford. So William Bradford, born in 1590 in Yorkshire in northeast England. I think his father died when he was an infant or very, very young, and basically William Bradford was brought up by family, but like uncles and grandparent or something like that. At a young age, in 1606, he joined a separatist Christian community, that meaning one that was definitely a Puritan Christian community, and one that was really very hardcore about their Puritan beliefs, and they wanted to, separate. They weren't just, wanting some mild changes. They wanted a completely separate church. So again, Bradford, English. For some of these people in the early 1600s, so again, we look at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, that was in 1603. The next person to come to power, the next monarch of England, is going to be James I. And so there were people that left England many Puritans who left England at this time in the first decade of the 17th century. And this, so the Scrooby community, this is just, it was the name of a little manor that was near Yorkshire, I think, near Nottinghamshire. So it's not, all it just refers to as a little manor village. So there are these English people who leave England to go live in the Netherlands. Bradford joins them. They're not sure what they want to do, where they want to go. They just can't, they don't feel like they can be in England anymore. They live in the Netherlands for almost a decade. And so when you read Bradford, he's upset about it because the people in the community, all of their children who are, being born and raised in the Netherlands, they don't even feel like they're English anymore. So finally, they spend nearly a decade in the Netherlands, all these different people who are going to. And finally, then we get to that fourth bullet point. In 1620, Bradford and so many others sail on the Mayflower. So we're finally getting to history that everyone is familiar with. So Bradford and these other Puritans, again, all of these people are, well, not everybody on the Mayflower, as a matter of fact, there are lots of people. First of all, the sailors are just sailors. They're they're not Puritans, they're sailors. But there are also people who are on the Mayflower who are not Puritans. They're going there for economic reasons, etc. But Bradford and his community, they're Puritans. 1620, they sail on the Mayflower, landing in Massachusetts. They originally were trying to go to Virginia, but they ended up in Massachusetts, easy miss. They land in Massachusetts, and now, so the word that we associate with these people, Bradford and all of those people who, land in Massachusetts in November of 1620, the word pilgrim. What in the world does that mean? Well, let's talk about that for just a moment. So, in Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, which you're reading, in his work of Plymouth Plantation, he uses the word pilgrim. He's the first person to use it, and that's where we now have this common sort of myth about the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving and all of that stuff. Well, where did that word come from? Why did he use that word pilgrim? Well, the word pilgrim comes from the etymology of pilgrim is Latin, and I forget what the original Latin word is, but it's connected to, well, it's obviously connected to pilgrimage, peregrination, and the original Latin word meant a traveler or someone from far away. That's what the original Latin word which is the etymological basis of our English word pilgrim. So, in Bradford's work of Plymouth Plantation, when he's writing about himself, and when he's writing about the people that came over on the Mayflower, these religious people, these Puritans, he uses the word pilgrims. We are pilgrims. What does he mean? Well, he's actually getting that from, as it says right there, it comes from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. So in the New Testament, Hebrews, which is traditionally, I think the authorship is ascribed to St. Paul, but that's not necessarily a story. It doesn't even really matter. It's in the New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews. And so the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, actually I think in chapter 11 is the beginning of the sort of the third part of Hebrews. Is an interesting thing to read. It's a letter, but it reads more like a sermon. And in chapter 11 is where the author is basically the author is meditating in a really fascinating way, actually, on faith, on what does it mean to have faith? And it's really interesting because faith it's almost like an invisible force or something. But anyway, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, the author is describing Abraham, the original patriarch. And so just as a quick refresher on the origin of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So Abraham, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Old Testament, this is the Abraham who in Genesis is living in Mesopotamia and is called by God to lead his wife, his family, his people, doesn't have children yet, to lead his wife and his people from Mesopotamia to Canaan. And he, establishes a covenant with God. And so he's the first patriarch. He's, one of the most important figures in the Hebrew Scriptures, or what Christians call the Old Testament. I mean, other than maybe like Moses, Noah, and like King David. So Abraham is the first patriarch. The covenant is to leave Mesopotamia, go to Canaan, and so now think for just a moment why William Bradford is calling himself a pilgrim in the same sense as Abraham. What he's doing, it's really skillful, intelligent thought process on Bradford's part. He's saying that himself and all of the other Puritans who come across in 1620, they're pilgrims. They are strangers who are on a religious quest, traveling someplace exactly, he's saying, exactly like Abraham. So Abraham has got a covenant with God, go to someplace new, travel west to Canaan, settle there, and then God says, I will bless you, I will bless your descendants. They will be, I think that's the, if I'm not mistaken, that's the line or something like your offspring will be more, something about the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the beach. But that's to Abraham. And so it's easy to see now why this word, which again, it comes from Hebrews 11:13, that Bradford is using it and thinking of himself. He's thinking of himself and his community of Puritans who are crossing the Atlantic Ocean, moving to this new place, which is a wilderness, moving to the new world, and trying to establish a new religious community there. And they feel that they've got a covenant with God to do that. So this is, it's almost like an arc from, not like Noah's Ark, but an arc as in like a connection or a parallel from Abraham. So that's what he's sort of thinking and seeing about that. And then just as before we wind things down, since we understand what pilgrim means and why he says that and why we still use that word to describe them, because it's coming from Bradford himself, he's saying that we're pilgrims. Then just as a sort of fun side note, well, in American vernacular, we could say the other popular use of the word pilgrim is by none other than John Wayne in the black and white westerns. And when John Wayne uses the word pilgrim, by the way, it's always it's an insult in the John Wayne black and white westerns, because he's saying like for, gosh, is it Jimmy Stewart, I think in one of the movies, Jimmy Stewart plays like a person who has come from out east, and so John Wayne keeps saying, hey, pilgrim, blah, 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 hey, pilgrim. And for John Wayne, it's an insult, because for him, pilgrim means somebody from out east who doesn't understand the Wild West. And I think it was originally applied to like Mormon settlers, supposedly. So that was probably a little random. Anyway, but that's a good way to end things here. So again, just kind of to recap here, this is all about, this lecture is trying to understand the Protestant Reformation, this huge important thing from the 1500s, which then eventually, changes religion in England, in the country, and then, but doesn't change it enough for some people. Some people who are very devout Christians, who really believe in Calvin's, who really believe in Calvin's ideas, don't find that the Church of England is, satisfying on a spiritual level. So that's why, first of all, in 1620, Bradford comes over, lands at Plymouth. Then we'll also be reading John Winthrop, who comes over a decade later. That's in 1630. Anne Bradstreet is with him. Anne Bradstreet's married. She comes over with her husband, her parents, etc. So all of these people are Puritans. And so that's a nice, now we have a nice clear understanding not only of what the Protestant Reformation is, but how that gives us Puritans, and then finally how Bradford uses the word pilgrim, and for him it's a connection to Abraham, seeing himself and his people as spiritual descendants, one might say, of Abraham and his original covenant to move to a new land. So there we go. And that concludes the lecture.